We're going to now have a further look into pathogens and their characteristics. So, today's learning intention is to be able to determine the characteristics of a pathogen. So, there are actually six types of pathogens, and we can break these up into cellular or living and acellular, which is non living. So, our living pathogens are parasites, protozoa, fungi, prokaryotes, and our acellular or non living are viruses and prions. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail into each of these now. So, for our parasites, these are organisms that live either in or on a host and get their food, but to the detriment of the host. So, it does harm them. They are not good at all. So these include things such as helminths, which we more simply know them as intestinal worms, such as tapeworm, or arthropods like ticks or spiders. So they're the ones that are going to live on top of you. Another one you might be quite familiar with is head lice. So I'm sure everyone has had head lice at least once during primary school or maybe even kindergarten, and they are also a parasite that live on top of us. So parasites only spend part of their life cycle inside a host, and they multiply outside of it. Though obviously, for ones such as fleas, ticks, or head lice, they do spend their time, I guess, on us, so outside. The next one we're looking at is protozoa. So protozoa actually are also parasites, except they are very small ones, and they most definitely live inside of us. So they're single celled, they are eukaryotic organisms, and they can cause many different diseases such as malaria and giardia. So you can see on the side here, I've got a picture of a mosquito here. Now, this mosquito is a particular type. So this is an Anopheles mosquito. And the reason why I've chosen a picture of the Anopheles mosquito is because it holds a very specific protozoa. Um, so this one is the Plasmodium falciparum protozoa or parasite. And what this is the protozoa that causes malaria. Now, there are lots of different plasmodium parasites that do cause malaria, but this one in particular is the most deadly. So, this one is responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of children in Africa, unfortunately. And as you can see, here's a whole bunch of cells around it, and these two little purple beans, I guess you could call them, are our Plasmodium falciparum. So, not a good parasite at all. In fact, it is life threatening. But of course, it's not all doom and gloom. There are a few protozoa, or many actually, that are harmless to humans. In fact, they are quite important in our food web. So they consume bacteria, which helps keep the bacterial populations down, and they also help in wastewater treatment and to keep our soil nice and fertile due to the products that they produce once they finish digesting our bacteria. The next one is fungi. So, as you know, we do use fungi a lot in our lives. So, yeast for baking, and we know that penicillin also comes from fungi as well, which we use as an antibiotic. But the thing with fungi is, of course, they are unable to make their own food. So this means that they need to be one of two things. So either a saprophyte, which live or on dead organic matter, so they'll decompose that and get their food from there, or they are a parasite, which means they will exist on living tissue or other organisms. So I don't know if you know, so I've got this picture up here, and as you can see, many of you might have seen before or seen in like fantasy books and novels or in children's books a little fairy circle like so. Now, the mushrooms that you see or that you eat out in the wild or at home, this isn't actually the fungi itself. This is actually its reproductive organisms. let that sink in for a bit. So this isn't the fungi itself. So fungi are actually microscopic. You cannot actually see fungi to the naked eye. The name of the little tiny microscopic part of the fungi is, I think, mycelium. From memory, though I could be a little bit wrong there in my pronunciation of it. And what happens is that the fungi itself actually grows outwards. So that's why you find that at the end of fairy circle would be technically the end of where the fungi currently is. So they just grow in this outwards kind of movement there. So that's why whenever you see a mold growing on food or particularly bread, I know in the past people have kind of just picked off the moldy bit and then still eaten the bread. By then, it's actually too late. Again, the mold is the reproductive part of the fungi. Um, all of the tiny microscopic fungi itself is actually all through your bread. So if you're one person who does that kind of thing and they just kind of pick the mold off, just chuck it out. You're still eating fungi. The whole loaf, not even that one slice, it's through your whole loaf. Just chuck it away. Okay. But anyway, you might be wondering, well, why am I talking about, the kind of way that the fungi grows and everything? Well, you can see down here, we've got kind of this ring shape on a human skin. So I don't know if you've heard of the disease called ringworm before. And it's usually characteristic by the little rings that show up on the human body. Now, despite its name, ringworm, it's not actually a worm or a parasite, it is actually a fungi. So, this here is a fungi and it is caused by the specific fungi of Tinea corporis. Again, I might have pronounced that incorrectly, but that is what it is. So, there's a fun fact for you. So, of course, as you can see, disease-causing fungi, usually attack the body surfaces, including skin and mucous membrane. So that's what we can see happening with this ringworm here. The next one is prokaryotes, so one of the ones that you might be more familiar with. So, of course, we know these more commonly as bacteria. So, with our bacteria, they do have the ability to reproduce really quickly due to the binary fission that they method that they use. And when we do have bacteria that do cause disease, they can produce toxic compounds called exotoxins. So, exo meaning like outside. Whereas if they are releasing toxic substances, so something that they kind of make from within, I guess you could say, then it's called an endotoxin. Okay, so endo inside, right? So that's how I remember it. So here you can see I've got again another example. So you might see this picture at the bottom here, and I'm not sure if you are familiar with the kind of artwork that came about in this time, but this is, I guess, an artistic depiction of the Black Plague or the Black Death or the bubonic plague, is a few of the common names for it. And people think that it was caused by a virus, but it was actually caused by this bacteria up here. So this bacteria is called Yersinia pestis, and this was actually transmitted by mice who had fleas, and the fleas were infected and with like this bacteria, and that would be what would bite people, and then this would cause that widespread bacteria that is was of course deadly. But of course, as we know, bacteria aren't all doom and gloom. It is actually very important inside of us. We've got a whole microbiome of bacteria. In fact, most of our body is mainly compromised of bacteria. In fact, there's probably more bacteria cells in your body than there are human cells. And they do help us do things such as digest some of the food within our intestines and all this other amazing stuff. But unfortunately, the bad ones, such as salmonella, that can cause food poisoning, or other things such as gastritis, meningitis, pneumonia, or strep throat, they aren't quite as pleasant, and some of them can definitely be life threatening. So, now moving on to our non living pathogens. So, the first one is a virus, and it's probably one of the very smallest forms of pathogens, and they are unable to reproduce outside of a host cell. So, unlike all our other ones where they were considered living because they've got things such as a nucleus and they've got all of their DNA and everything inside of the nuclei and everything like that to help them reproduce, viruses cannot do that by themselves. They're pretty much essentially just a capsule um, that contains some genetic material. So, because it doesn't have all the other organelles that some of our living pathogens have, it requires a host to reproduce for them. So, we've got two different types of viruses. They're either DNA based, so known as adenoviruses, or RNA based, known as retroviruses. We'll learn a bit more about DNA and RNA in other topics of biology. But a really interesting thing is that if you think of DNA is a double stranded helix, that codes all of our genes and everything. And we consider this to be quite stable. Whereas if we think about RNA based viruses, it's only a single strand and it is a lot more susceptible to change. So, an interesting fact is, as you can see, I've got a picture of a coronavirus here. Now, the coronavirus is a single stranded RNA based virus, which means it is one that is able to mutate very quickly, which is why we've seen in the news and the media about all the different types of coronavirus that has been popping up here and there and rapidly and everywhere. And what happens is that the more times a RNA based virus can infect a person, it is more likely that its genetic code will be changed when the host cell is coding the DNA, right? So think about if it's jumping from many, many people, in a very fast or small amount of time, then that is a lot of times and chances for it to actually change its genetic coding. And that's why we have all the different um, coronavirus, like the Delta and Gamma and all the different types of coronavirus that we have seen pop up all over the world. Okay. Another RNA based virus that you might have heard of is the flu. So, this is why every single year you have to get a new flu shot because the flu last year is not the same as the flu this year, and it won't be the same as the flu that comes about next year, right? Because, same thing, it is an RNA based virus, so it changes a lot more quickly than a stable DNA virus. So, when a virus does enter into a host cell and produce inside of it, it usually destroys the cell that is in so that it can release all of its little mini viruses all around. So it's able to attack then new host cells, and eventually it will be able to get to the part of the body where you will excrete it out and in or expel it out by coughing, sneezing, all that other stuff to other people. Okay. The very last pathogen that we're going to be going through, and the also other non living one, is a prion. So, our prions are just abnormally folded proteins, and what they do is that they cause other normally proteins to misfold. So, because prions are proteins, there's actually nothing we can do to prevent or stop this from happening if you do happen to get a prion disease. So, unfortunately, if you do get it, you will probably die. But luckily, they are incredibly rare. So, um, you might be wondering, I have a picture of a cow here. So, way back a few decades ago now, there was something that was called mad cow disease that started in the UK. And what was happening was that these cows had these prions. And what was happening was that people were then eating these farm cows and consuming them as meat, so beef and everything like that, and they were contracting prions. And so then they were getting things such neurodegenerative diseases such as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD for short. And what happens is that when these prions cause your proteins to misfold, what it does is that once it gets into your brain, it actually starts bursting all of your nerve cells, and you start getting holes in your brain, and your brain actually becomes quite spongy and soft. So you can see in this picture over here, um, we've got these holes, and that is caused by the prions bursting those nerve cells. So the reason why these cows actually got these prions was because they were actually feeding them sheep that also had prions as well. They had another disease, I forget its name now, starts with an S. And they were actually feeding cows sheep to try and help bulk them up. And as we know, cows are herbivores, so that really just shouldn't have happened anyway. That was very unethical of them. So what they had to do was to try and stop prions, because as we know, there is no known treatments of this, was they actually had to go and kill all of these cows, dig them into big grave pits and burn them, right? So, prions, they are incredibly rare, barely around anymore, but it can happen. And unfortunately, kind of the only way to prevent this is to not eat beef. So I'm sorry if anyone is someone who likes to eat meat, but maybe I've turned you into the vegetarian or vegan side. But that would be one of the very few ways to ever stop yourself from getting prions if you are scared at all. But anyway, now that we've gone through our six different pathogens, I have got a way, if you wanted to, be a successful pathogen. So the very first thing is you need to be able to colonize a host. So, you can't just be a little virus that's just kind of sitting outside somebody, right? You actually need a human or a host to be able to replicate yourself. So the first thing is to get into the host. Once you're in the host, what you need to be able to do is to then find nutrition to keep yourself alive. Viruses don't really have this issue, they are non living, but other things such as protozoa, parasites, as well as our bacteria, they need nutrition to survive. The other thing that you need to be able to do is to avoid the host's immune responses. So, as you know, when you get sick, that is your body with its immune response trying to get rid of that pathogen. So, the pathogen needs to avoid all of that. The next thing they need to do is to be able to actually reproduce. There's no point getting inside of a human and then finding nutrition and then dying inside of them, right? You need to actually be able to keep on living and keep reproducing. So you need to make sure that you can get in and reproduce. And the very last thing you need to do is to then exit the host somewhere else so that you can keep spreading all your brethren and children along so that there's many more generations of you to come. Okay, so that is the 5 steps on how to be a successful pathogen. And as you can see here, my very happy pathogen that I created is very happy because he is successful as seen by his top hat. So, I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned a bit. If you need, make sure you go back and take any notes or ask any questions of me in class if anything did not make sense for you.